The city breathes a rotten air tonight, thick with the unfulfilled promises of the good life and the stale sweat of desperate men. It's a humid, suffocating blanket that settles over lower Manhattan, dampening the neon glow of false hope and magnifying the sound of every transgression. When the darkness is this deep, the law becomes a distant, theoretical concept, a promise whispered on a political stage miles away. Down here in the concrete canyons and forgotten gutters, only gravity and immediate consequence hold sway. This is the hour when the city's true inhabitants emerge, not the bankers, not the tourists, but the bottom feeders, the scavengers, who mistake weakness for opportunity and cruelty for power. They operate in the fringes, where the flickering streetlights give up the ghost, leaving black patches large enough to swallow innocence whole. The alley was a scar on the side of a derelict warehouse, a throat choked with industrial grime and yesterday's refuse. It smelled of mildew, stale beer, and the metallic tang of latent violence. It was exactly the kind of place you walk past quickly, head down, praying the shadows don't notice you exist. Tonight the shadows were hungry. He was just a kid, maybe 18, wearing the frayed colors of someone trying too hard to look invisible. He had been walking home from a late shift, maybe carrying $10 in his wallet and a head full of dreams that the street was preparing to extinguish. The two men who found him were composites of the city's failure, large, sloppy, fueled by cheap adrenaline and the certainty that no one would intervene. They had cornered him with the casual efficiency of predators who have done this too many times to count. The sound started small, the scrape of cheap leather on slick concrete, a sharp, choked gasp of surprise that transitioned instantly into pure animal panic. Then came the heavy thud of the boy being slammed against the brickwork, the vibration traveling through the pavement like a tremor of pure injustice. They weren't interested in the $10, not really. They wanted the fear. They wanted the dominion. The sound of their low, guttural laughter was worse than a punch. It was the soundtrack to the city's moral surrender. "Stay quiet, kid," one of them snarled, his voice thick and devoid of humanity. "And maybe we just take your shoes." The boy struggled, his resistance weak and frantic. It was the thrashing of a fly caught in amber. He knew instinctively that quiet compliance was just the first step toward something much worse. The desperation broke through the barrier of terror, and a sound ripped from his chest, raw and entirely without pretense. "Someone help me. Please, someone help me." The cry was thin, piercing the humid night air. It was a sound directed upward, past the smoke-stained brick and the razor wire, aimed at the abstract concept of a responsible adult, a police patrol, a just God. It was the oldest prayer in the concrete jungle, the desperate appeal for intervention. For a moment, the two attackers froze, their cheap triumph momentarily interrupted by the potential of witnesses. They scoffed, recovering quickly, certain that even if someone heard, no one would dare look. This city had taught its residents the brutal lesson of self-preservation. Turn your back, keep walking, pretend the scream belongs to someone else's nightmare. They dragged the boy deeper into the recess of the alley, pulling him past the rusted dumpster and the oily puddle that reflected the sick yellow light above. They were convinced they had bought themselves anonymity, that the darkness had sealed the transaction. But the darkness here was not always empty. In the deepest well of shadow, where the moisture met the cold brick, something shifted. It wasn't the sound of approaching footsteps. It was the absence of sound. It was a silence too perfect, too deliberate for this chaotic street. It was the kind of unnatural stillness that signals the presence of a hunter who has spent a lifetime mastering the art of erasing his own footprint. One of the perpetrators, the taller, more aggressive one, paused in his brutal work. He didn't hear anything, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, prickled by an instinct older than civilization. He felt abruptly that the air had grown heavy, the temperature dropping a few degrees, a sensation akin to walking into an open meat locker. He turned his head slowly toward the absolute blackness at the alley's terminus. Nothing, just the shadows interlocking, folding into themselves. "What is it, man? Hurry up," the second assailant muttered impatiently, his hands already heavy on the struggling boy. "Nothing," the tall one lied, though his breath hitched slightly. His certainty had begun to erode, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar dread. He glanced back, ready to dismiss the feeling as paranoia, when a flicker of reflected light caught his eye. It was momentary, gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was distinct, the dull sheen of hard metal catching the sickly sodium vapor filtering from the street mouth. The man squinted. He couldn't define the shape, but he saw the silhouette detach itself from the wall, moving without the characteristic shuffle of an ordinary human being. This figure was pure verticality, monolithic, draped in ballistic black that seemed to absorb all ambient light, turning itself into a hole in the visual plane. He wore the night like a second skin, but beneath the armor, the intent was palpable. It wasn't just a threat of physical confrontation. It was the profound certainty of a final judgment being delivered. The figure stepped into the edge of the weak, fractured illumination, and the details began to resolve. The uncompromising shape of a heavy combat boot meeting the concrete without a whisper. The purposeful hang of something weighty and engineered at the hip. The disciplined, utterly still posture of a man who does not need to posture. And then his focus was drawn inevitably to the chest. It was painted white against the field of tactical black, a symbol that wasn't an artistic flourish or a gang tag. It was stark, crude, and utterly terrifying in its implications. A skull, stylized and fierce, a declaration of war against the living. It was not a warning, it was a destination. The tall predator's arrogance dissolved entirely, replaced by a sudden, icy understanding of his grave miscalculation. This wasn't a witness. This was the consequence no law enforcement agency could deliver. This was the cold, efficient retribution that the city often deserved but rarely received. The assailant froze, his hands dropping from the boy's collar as if the victim had suddenly become electrified. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, dissolving into a meager, pathetic cough. The vigilante, having materialized fully from the matrix of the city's decay, did not rush. He did not speak. His presence alone was an overwhelming, crushing weight. He simply stood there, perfectly framed by the entrance to the alley, his eyes, invisible beneath the shadow cast by the cowl, focused entirely on the two men who had dared to think they could violate the innocent under his watch. The boy, huddled against the wall, stopped crying. He didn't understand who the figure was, only that the air had changed. The oppressive atmosphere of casual cruelty had been replaced by the razor edge of absolute, unrelenting danger. His desperate cry for help had finally been answered, but the entity that arrived was not a savior. It was the reckoning. The vigilante took one slow, deliberate step forward, and the sound of that single bootfall echoed in the enclosed space, a final stroke of the hammer striking the anvil of fate. The first predator instinctively took a stuttering half-step back, trying to merge back into the wall, suddenly realizing that the hunter was now the hunted, and the game had just turned irrevocably lethal. The silent promise hanging in the humid air was terrifyingly simple. The dragging, the crying, the injustice. It had all just served as the necessary preamble. The judgment was now in session. The confrontation, though static in its initial posture, was not silent. It was defined by a profound lack of sound from the vigilante and an overwhelming eruption of internal noise from the two men now facing him. The tall assailant, whose name was Leon, recognized the skull instantly, not from television or police files, but from the whispered, frantic warnings traded in the deepest, most predatory strata of the underworld. This was not a target to be robbed or roughed up. This was the Reaper come early. Leon's survival mechanism screamed at him to flee, but his muscles were locked, the primitive fear overwhelming the motor centers of his brain. His partner, Mickey, slower to process existential threat, shifted his weight, his cheap leather jacket creaking in the suffocating stillness. Mickey tried to retrieve the switchblade he kept tucked into his waistband, a movement so clumsy and slow it felt like a parody of aggression. The vigilante reacted not with haste, but with inevitability. The movement was economical, a blur only to the eye untrained in lethal efficiency. Before Mickey could clear the handle of the dull steel, the vigilante was on him, covering the intervening distance in a single, soundless glide. There was no theatrical wind-up, no wasted energy, just the heavy armored shoulder driving into Mickey's sternum. The impact was audible, a sharp, wet cough of air escaping Mickey's lungs as he was slammed backward against the brick wall. He didn't drop. He slid down unconscious before his body reached the pavement, the switchblade clattering harmlessly away. The sound was swallowed instantly by the ambient drone of the city. Leon finally found his footing, turning to bolt toward the street mouth. He got 3 desperate strides in before the world dissolved into pain. The vigilante had not pursued him with speed, but had used his momentum against him. A weighted open palm strike, precise, surgical, connected just below the occipital ridge. The blow was designed not to kill, but to neutralize the central nervous system instantly, shutting down the lights without the messy, public fanfare of a scream. Leon crumpled, his knees giving out simultaneously, landing in the greasy rainwater pooled near an overflowing dumpster. He lay there, twitching once, a marionette whose strings had been severed by a meticulous hand. It had taken less than 4 seconds. The violence was cold, clinical, devoid of emotion. It was less a fight and more an act of percussive maintenance. The vigilante didn't spare the unconscious forms a second glance. His attention immediately shifted to the only remaining variable. The boy. The youth, still trembling, had witnessed the impossible, the sudden, terrifying arrival, and the brutal, silent dispatch of his tormentors. He was curled against the wall, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the black boots planted firmly on the alley concrete. The vigilante knelt down, an immense, imposing figure folding itself carefully. He did not touch the boy. He did not offer reassurances. He simply presented a fact. The danger was gone. From a deep internal pocket of his tactical vest, he withdrew a small, heavy object, a burner phone, black and sealed, engineered for a single, secure call. He placed it silently on the pavement next to the boy's hand. "When you can walk, leave this place." The vigilante's voice was a low, synthesized rumble, devoid of inflection, a machine speaking through static. "Go to the 7th Street Diner. Order a coffee and wait. Do not talk to anyone about tonight. Do not answer questions. Use this phone only if you are questioned by law enforcement or need immediate help. Ask for the clerk. Understand?" The boy could only nod, a minuscule movement of his head against the damp brick. He gripped the phone instinctively, its cold weight grounding him amidst the chaos. The vigilante stood up, the action radiating immense physical power, turning his back on the victim and the perpetrators alike. The incident was closed. The ledger was balanced. But Frank Castle, the man beneath the armor, the engine of this terrifying machine, knew the true ledger was never balanced by simple street justice. These 2 lowlifes were symptoms, viral loads in the massive septic organism that was the city. Killing them was like scraping mold off the surface of a rotten foundation. The structure itself was compromised. He moved silently out of the alley mouth, melting into the denser urban fabric. He was seeking higher ground, a perch from which to analyze the remnants of the attack. He climbed 3 flights of rusted fire escape stairs behind a condemned haberdashery, ignoring the structural groans of the metal beneath his heavy boots. Reaching the rooftop, a gravelled landscape dotted with humming HVAC units, he found his chosen vantage point, a shadow cast by a leaking water tower that smelled faintly of brine and ozone. The rain hadn't stopped. It had merely slowed to a persistent greasy mist, clinging to everything and dulling the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. Below him, the city pulsed, a slow, malevolent heartbeat echoing the corruption he was tasked to eradicate. Castle stood rigid, allowing the cool moisture to soak into the outer layers of his armor. His mind, usually a high-speed processor dedicated to tactical analysis, now slowed to a methodical grind. Why here? Why them? Street crime was usually opportunistic, fueled by desperation or cheap fixes, but these 2 had been specific in their target, grabbing the boy with brutal, practiced certainty. It felt like an enforcement action, not a robbery. He activated the encrypted radio link in his mask, connecting to his hidden digital infrastructure, a network of repurposed military servers buried deep in the global dark net, nicknamed the War Room. Now Source 2. Pull the profiles on 2 registered low-level offenders, Leon Vance, Mickey Rourke, last known to operate out of the Hell's Gate territory, associated with the Iron Coin Collection crew. Check for recent spikes in their communications or sudden movements of disposable cash. The response came almost instantly, a sterile female voice transmitted directly into his earpiece. Acknowledged. Initiating cross-referencing against municipal police logs and federal intelligence watch lists. Estimated time to preliminary report. 80 seconds. Castle didn't wait. He used the time to examine the city below, seeing not buildings and traffic, but a map of contagion. The rot wasn't random, it centralized around power and money. The Iron Coin crew wasn't just loan sharks. They were collection agents for a much larger, insidious organism. The Sindicato, a consortium of untouchable white-collar criminals who leveraged street muscle to enforce their financial dominance. He had always found the financiers more repugnant than the street thugs. The thugs were animals operating on instinct. The men in suits, however, operated on calculated cruelty, using law and legitimate business practices as shields while they engineered the destruction of entire neighborhoods. Leon and Mickey were merely the low-grade fertilizer for the Sindicato's garden of decay. The boy, likely the son of someone who owed a payment they couldn't make, was just leverage. "Report compiled, Source 1," the voice announced, snapping him back to the present. "Leon Vance and Mickey Rourke have displayed unusually high activity over the last 72 hours, not focused on loan collections, but surveillance. Their geo-coordinates indicate sustained, focused monitoring of one address, 142 Bleecker Street, a municipal planning office employee residence. Target, Elias Thorne." Thorne. A name meant nothing until the context was attached. Elias Thorne, age 54, mid-level zoning commissioner, clean record, financially leveraged. His wife, Maria, recently inherited a substantial piece of commercial property in the Lower Docks district. This property is currently the subject of an intense, highly politicized redevelopment bid, stalled by Thorne's department. Castle's jaw tightened beneath the cowl. The pattern solidified instantly. The Sindicato wanted the land. Thorne was the bottleneck. They didn't threaten Thorne directly. That was too messy. They went for the cheapest, fastest point of leverage, the perceived safety of his child. This was the bureaucratic face of evil. The violence was just the accounting. Run a full financial profile on Thorne, focusing on outstanding debts, loan origination points, and any unusual communications with known associates of the Sindicato's legal front, harbor assets, and redevelopment. Simultaneously, track the physical movement of the two captured subjects. I need to know who pulls them out of lockup and who pays their bail. The Vigilante spent the next 4 hours perched atop the city, motionless, absorbing data and calculating trajectories. The drizzle continued, making the air heavy with the metallic tang of exhaust and the faint underlying stink of uncollected refuse, the true scent of unchecked capitalism. He reviewed Thorne's profile. The man was clean, a quiet civil servant caught in a tidal wave of greed. But the pressure had been applied ruthlessly. Thorne had taken out a series of high-interest, short-term loans, all traceable back to shell companies managed by harbor assets. The principle wasn't the point. The control was. The Sindicato had manufactured the vulnerability, then leveraged it. The cruelty is the point, Castle mused internally. They didn't just want the property. They wanted Thorne to suffer the slow, grinding humiliation of watching his life unravel until he cracked. Update, Source 1. Leon Vance and Mickey Rourke were processed and bailed out exactly 47 minutes after transport. Bail was posted by an anonymous third party through the law offices of Dalton and Price. Dalton and Price specializes in high net worth individual defense and corporate regulatory evasion. They represent harbor assets and redevelopment exclusively. The connection was watertight, predictable, and infuriating. The muscle was disposable, but the network was robust. The city's legal system served as a prophylactic against true justice. Dalton and Price were the disease vectors, the lawyers who sanitized the bloodshed and ensured the money kept flowing upward, away from accountability. Castle felt the familiar, cold pressure building in his chest, a controlled fury that had long replaced grief. He could have finished Leon and Mickey in the alley, saving the city the expense of processing them. But they were useful now. They were loose strings leading back to the puppet master. He needed to follow the lawyers. Dalton and Price occupied the 30th floor of the monolithic obsidian-black harbor tower, a beacon of sterile power rising above the grime of the docks they were trying to steal. Castle knew he couldn't simply walk in. The building was a fortress of surveillance and controlled access. He needed intelligence, and he needed a vulnerability. He shifted his focus to the human element. Lawyers like those at Dalton and Price were professionals, but they were also creatures of comfort. susceptible to routine and predictable indulgences. They celebrated their wins, they commiserated their losses, and they all had weak points hidden beneath the bespoke tailoring. Source 2. Pivot to surveillance on the partners of Dalton and Price. Priority targets: Thomas Dalton, managing partner, and Alastair Pearce, lead regulator attorney. I need their routines, their vices, their private residences, and most importantly, their security protocols after midnight. He knew the process. It wasn't always a direct assault. Sometimes the best way to destroy a wall was to find the mortar dust that held the bricks together. He wouldn't target the firm's servers, too easily traceable. He would target the people who ran the firm, the fragile egos and compromised morals that defined their success. As dawn began to bleed a pale, polluted grey into the eastern sky, washing the rooftops with a damp chill, Castle descended. He wasn't moving toward Harbour Tower yet. He was moving toward the infrastructure required for the necessary intrusion. His immediate destination was a defunct subway tunnel beneath the financial district, a place where the city's failed ambitions lay rotting and where he maintained one of his hidden tactical caches. He needed specialized gear, tools for bypassing advanced electronic locks, for nullifying acoustic surveillance, and perhaps most crucially, a system for extracting data from a panicked, compromised lawyer without leaving physical evidence. The hunt had changed scale. It was no longer about defending the immediate innocent. It was about tearing out the tumor that allowed the casual violation of the innocent to become profitable. Castle moved through the pre-dawn streets, a shadow among shadows, his combat boots barely clicking on the wet pavement. He passed homeless encampments stirring to life, the forgotten citizens who were both the victims and the mute witnesses to the city's moral bankruptcy. He saw a police cruiser glide slowly past, the officers inside focused on anything but the decay they were meant to police. The skull on his chest felt heavier, not just a symbol of vengeance, but a grim commitment to a war that required infinite patience and zero forgiveness. The alley incident was a data point. The removal of Dalton and Price would be a strategic strike against the institutional rot. He had hours of preparation ahead of him, hours of crawling through the city's unseen arteries, preparing the groundwork for the inevitable confrontation with the men who saw human beings as expendable line items on a financial spreadsheet. The rain picked up, cold and driving now, washing the streets, but failing entirely to cleanse the deep-seated filth that permeated the soul of the metropolis. Frank Castle was the detergent the city desperately needed, even if the process of cleaning would inevitably be painful, loud, and final. He was ready to begin the deep scrub. The descent into the old subway tunnel was a plunge into the city's geologic memory, a burial ground for municipal failures wrapped in damp concrete and the persistent odor of ozone and stagnant water. The access point was a maintenance grate behind a forgotten electrical substation, a signature scar that only the truly desperate or the permanently invisible knew how to read. Castle dropped through the opening, the sound of the street dissolving instantly into a heavy, muffled silence, broken only by the drip of groundwater filtering through the bedrock above. Here, miles beneath the bespoke arrogance of Harbour Tower, the true architecture of the city lay exposed. Rusting rebar wept onto tracks, long since severed from the living network. The air was colder, thick with a leaden humidity that seemed to press down on the lungs. This was one of the many forgotten rooms where Castle stored his infrastructure, a necessary ecosystem for a man fighting a war the government pretended didn't exist. He moved 50 yards down the dark tunnel until he reached a reinforced section of wall disguised by a crumbling service panel. The lock mechanism required biometric input and a rolling encryption key, redundancies built for deep paranoia. As the small panel hissed open, revealing a hidden room, the pale light of his headlamp cut across a meticulously organized arsenal. This wasn't a cache for street fights, it was a surgical theater. The gear laid out was not for confrontation, but for information extraction and non-lethal neutralization. He selected a specific set of tools, a low-amperage electronic disruptor designed to fry high-end proximity sensors without triggering localized alarms, a compact military-grade RF scanner capable of mapping the wireless security protocols of an entire skyscraper floor. And most critical, a hypodermic injector system loaded with a short-acting, highly potent anesthetic, enough to stop a man's movements for precisely 15 minutes leaving him disoriented but alive and responsive to targeted interrogation. Castle sat on a folding stool, the cold radiating up through his heavy clothing, and pulled out the hardened laptop that served as his tactical command center. He needed to internalize the intelligence supplied by Source 2 before he made his next move. Attacking Dalton and Price meant facing layers of institutional protection, private security, automated systems, and the assumption of untouchability that their wealth afforded. The file detailing the surveillance on Thomas Dalton and Alistair Pierce opened with a muted "were." Dalton, the managing partner, was the fortress, 62 years old, rigid routine, rarely left his penthouse after 9 p.m., moved exclusively in armored vehicles, and maintained a tight circle of ex-federal bodyguards. He was the strategic pillar, too insulated for a direct assault without major collateral disruption. Pierce, the lead regulator attorney, was the current of sewage that flowed beneath the pillar. 45, younger, fueled by ambition and the necessary cynicism required to launder the city's darkest secrets into clean, billable hours. Pierce was sloppy where Dalton was meticulous. The data showed a pattern. Tuesdays and Thursdays, after the firm closed its books for the day, Pierce would shed his professional skin. He would meet various consultants and lobbyists, euphemisms for fixers and bagmen, at a series of high-end, unmarked social clubs in the meatpacking district. The arrogance of the successful snake, Castle thought, the screen reflecting the pale light on his impassive face. Pierce used these meetings not just to conduct business but to validate his own ascent. He drank premium scotch, often to excess, and the surveillance footage confirmed a troubling trend. Pierce would frequently discuss sensitive, unverified client data after his third glass, seeking to impress his associates with the sheer scale of the corruption he managed. Source 2 had flagged a persistent digital anomaly. While Pierce used highly encrypted proprietary firm devices during office hours, he maintained a secondary personal network. A private, unsecured wireless access point at his luxury condo in the Upper East Side had been logged, making extremely late-night backups to a personal cloud storage service. Why would a lawyer dealing with billion-dollar crime cartels be backing up files at 3 a.m. onto an insecure personal server? Paranoia, the disease of men who deal in treachery. Pierce likely didn't trust Dalton. He was building his own lifeboat, ensuring he held enough compromising material on the firm's deepest secrets to leverage his survival if the empire ever collapsed. That digital thread, thin and shimmering in the surveillance data, was the vulnerability Castle had been hunting for. The key wasn't to breach the iron fortress of Harbour Tower. The key was to exploit the human frailty of Alistair Pierce. Castle spent the next 4 hours immersed in the analysis, building a topographical map of Pierce's weekly movements. The rain outside had transitioned from a heavy downpour to a persistent, chilling drizzle, and the sound of it occasionally echoed faintly through the tunnel system, a distant reminder of the world above. He synthesized the data, focusing on the upcoming Tuesday schedule. Pierce had a late dinner scheduled at the Vault, a club known for its soundproofing and its clientele of highly compromised politicians and wealthy criminals. Pierce wouldn't return home until likely 2:30 a.m. His building security was robust. Doormen, coded elevators, high-definition cameras, but Pierce himself was the weak point. He often dismissed his security escort a block away, preferring to walk the final stretch alone, perhaps to clear his head, or perhaps to simply enjoy the illusion of solitude his money bought him. This small window, the short walk from the corner of 68th and Madison to his front door, between 2:30 a.m. and 2:45 a.m., was where the attack had to occur. It required surgical precision, intercept Pierce, neutralize him quickly without alerting street cameras or potential witnesses, extract the necessary digital access credentials, and disappear back into the night before the anesthetic wore off. He began the physical preparation, assembling the bespoke electronic gear. He wasn't bringing firearms. This mission wasn't about ending life. It was about stripping away anonymity. Dalton and Price relied on the confidentiality of the grave. Castle would ensure they lost that shield. He selected a highly customized data retrieval unit, small, shielded, and capable of a rapid, deep-level scan of a mobile device's core memory. The device was designed to look for specific file extensions related to legal evidence, encryption keys, and communication logs. As he calibrated the equipment, His mind drifted back to the alley incident. The young boy, the terror in his voice, the casual brutality of the low-level thugs, Leon and Mickey. Those men were the street litter. Dalton and Pierce were the sanitation engineers, the ones who ensured the litter was composted into profit. This surgical strike wasn't just revenge, it was an exercise in systemic sanitation. If he could crack Pierce's hidden files, he could expose the entire infrastructure that allowed the city to thrive on exploitation. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering, documented even in the sanitized summaries he was reading. Dalton and Price wasn't just representing drug lords, they were facilitating the slow erosion of municipal pension funds, defending corporate polluters, and, perhaps most disgustingly, specializing in exploiting eminent domain law to displace the poor and funnel prime real estate to their clients. Every action they took was legal, or at least rendered untouchable by their legal maneuverings. They had monetized moral rot. Castle gripped a circuit board, the cold metal grounding his focus. He knew the true nature of his war was not against violence, but against the justification of violence. When the system becomes the greatest criminal, conventional morality is obsolete. He ran dry drills in the tunnel, simulating the approach, the injection, the extraction process. He needed absolute silence and efficiency. The secondary complication he needed to account for was panic. Pierce was a predator in the courtroom, but physically he was soft, likely to become hysterical under duress. Castle had to be prepared to manage the panic without resorting to violence that would draw unwanted attention. The 15-minute window was unforgiving. Hours passed. The glow of the tactical map illuminated the lines of transit and the points of vulnerability. When he finally looked up, the air in the tunnel felt thin, recycled, but his internal focus was complete. He had a timetable, a target, and a method. He carefully sealed the majority of the cache, leaving only the necessary tools packed into a compartmentalized urban assault pack, designed to look like a simple hiking backpack to any casual observer. The grey of pre-dawn had finally yielded to a sickly urban daylight filtering down the access shaft. It was time to move. He ascended back into the world. The shift from the sterile cold of the tunnel to the chaotic dampness of the street, feeling like a transition between two different realities. The city was waking up, its arteries clogging with commuters, the unwitting tax base for the corruption he was about to expose. He passed a coffee stand where the vendor was wiping down a greasy counter, his face etched with exhaustion. The lives of these people, the ones who did the honest labor, were the true victims of Dalton and Price. Their taxes paid for the security forces that protected the rich, and their regulations were bent to accommodate the criminal enterprises. Castle paused for a moment, not to rest but to observe the flow. He was invisible to them, a ghost in the crowd. He wasn't hunting today. He was stalking, laying the groundwork for the trap. The confrontation with Alistair Pierce was still 2 days away. 2 days that Castle would spend ensuring every contingency was covered, every exit mapped, every sensor understood. He moved away from the financial district, merging with the flow of humanity, heading toward a necessary temporary staging area closer to Pierce's residence. The Vigilante war was 1 part firepower, 9 parts logistics, and 50 parts patience. The city continued its relentless churn, unaware of the quiet, disciplined force that was moving beneath its surface, ready to expose the rot. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the harsh, uncompromising reality of the morning. Frank Castle walked toward the next phase of his campaign, the weight of the city's moral deficit pressing heavily against his resolve. He would wait for Pierce in the shadows, not for vengeance but for the truth, the kind of truth that rips foundations apart. This was the long scrub, and he had only just begun to apply the abrasive force. The clock was ticking toward Tuesday night. The tactical reality of movement dictated that Castle had to blend, becoming less a hunter and more a shadow woven into the fabric of the urban sprawl. He navigated the transition zone, where the manicured lawns of the professional elite gave way to the dense, layered poverty of the downtown periphery. Here the buildings were older, their stone facades perpetually wet, absorbing the city's grime like thirsty sponges. The air held the metallic tang of exhaust and the faint, sweet decay of refuse waiting for collection. This was the city's digestive tract, the place where its waste settled. He was focused, tracking the rhythm of the city's sensors and the casual neglect of its inhabitants. Every parked vehicle, every high window was a potential vantage point. He was 2 blocks from a planned route adjustment when the sound reached him. Not loud, but possessing a quality of pure, unadulterated terror that cut through the metropolitan din like shattered glass. A cry. Sharp, young, desperate. "Someone help me!" Castle froze, melting against the damp brick of an old warehouse wall. His internal clock, previously set to the precise execution of the Pierce operation, suddenly paused, demanding immediate attention to the present disaster. The sound came from the mouth of a service alley, a black cleft between a closed-down laundromat and a derelict florist. These alleys were the veins of the city where the law rarely ventured, places where opportunistic cruelty thrived. He moved toward the opening, his pace shifting from the casual stroll of a commuter to the silent, coiled tension of a predator. He didn't think. The decision was instantaneous, driven by a code older than any mission blueprint. He was the consequence that followed desperation. He slipped into the shadows. The alley was poorly lit by a single flickering fluorescent fixture near a dumpster, casting erratic, sickly yellow light that only amplified the darkness. 2 figures were silhouetted against the weak illumination, hunched over a third, smaller figure. The victim was curled in a fetal position, his breath catching in ragged sobs. The attackers were sloppy, fueled by cheap adrenaline and the intoxicating sense of power over the vulnerable. One, taller and leaner, was reaching into the boy's worn jacket pocket. The other was providing clumsy physical intimidation. Castle let the shadows swallow him completely. He was not a spectacle, he was a solution. The lean man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Easy, kid, just gonna borrow this rent money, yeah?" The boy renewed his plea, a raw, primal noise. "Please, I don't have anything. Just leave me alone." That sound, the complete abandonment of hope, was the trigger. Castle moved in a blur, minimizing momentum to reduce noise, maximizing leverage to ensure immediate incapacitation. He reached the taller man first. One hand clamped over the man's mouth and nose, silencing the startled cry, while the other delivered a precise, non-lethal strike to the vagus nerve below the ear. The man's eyes glazed over. His body went instantly slack, dropping heavily into Castle's arms like a sack of dead weight. The second thug, startled by the sudden absence of his partner, spun around clumsily, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He saw only a vague, massive shape emerging from the gloom, framed by the sickly yellow halo of the distant streetlight. Before the thug could process the threat, Castle had closed the distance. This one was more aggressive, throwing a wild, untrained punch aimed at the torso. Castle intercepted the blow, twisting the wrist and using the thug's own momentum to guide him face first into the cold, damp brick wall. There was a dull thud, and the thug slid down unconscious, ending the conflict in less than 5 seconds. Silence returned, heavier and more profound than the prior chaos. Only the shivering breaths of the boy remained. Castle stood over the scene, his outline stark, the skull insignia on his chest plate, hidden beneath a heavy, dark coat, a silent promise of inevitable reckoning. The boy, maybe 13, looked up, terrified, seeing the immediate aftermath of violence, yet realizing the violence was not aimed at him. His eyes, wide and shining with unshed tears, fixed on Castle. Castle crouched low, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, stripped of inflection, a sound intended to calm, not command. "You're safe now. Do you live nearby?" The boy could only nod, his jaw trembling. "Get out of here. Go home. Don't look back. Don't tell anyone what you saw." Castle reached out not to comfort, but to ensure the boy was physically able to move. He gave the slightest upward pressure to the shoulder. "Move." The boy scrambled to his feet, eyes darting from Castle to the 2 prone figures, then back to Castle. He didn't need a second instruction. He bolted from the alley mouth, running until his quick, panicked footsteps faded into the street noise. Castle watched him go, ensuring the trajectory was safe. The immediate crisis was resolved. But the intervention had cost him valuable time, and more importantly, operational purity. He was now tainted by unnecessary exposure, however minor. He had to assume that the boy, terrified and relieved, would mention the man in the shadows to someone, even if unintentionally. And the police, inefficient as they were, still monitored violent incidents in this district. He quickly assessed the two unconscious thugs. Both were alive, breathing heavily, guaranteed to be out for at least an hour. He dragged them deeper into the shadows, arranging them behind a row of overflowing industrial bins, ensuring they wouldn't be found immediately, buying himself a necessary buffer. He didn't want the police finding a crime scene that linked back to his chosen staging area, or worse, finding the boy and pressing him for details that could lead to an unwanted surveillance spike. He retrieved the simple nylon assault pack and adjusted his direction. The planned route near Pierce's residence was now too risky. He needed to disappear again, to reset his footprint. The 15-minute buffer he'd given himself for movement had been consumed, and the risk matrix had shifted from controlled logistics to immediate damage control. He moved silently back onto the main street, blending once more, but his internal landscape had changed. The brief burst of necessary violence had sharpened his focus, but it had also forced him into a dangerous reflection. The long scrub. That was what he called this mission against Dalton and Price, a systematic removal of the rot. But here, in the cold, wet alley, he saw the direct, visceral consequence of that rot. Pierce and his high-dollar lawyers didn't pull the trigger or twist the knife, but their actions, the systemic disenfranchisement, the defense of drug routes, the manipulation of poverty laws, created the environment where those two thugs felt entitled to prey on a child. The corporate rot always trickled down, turning the city into a feeding frenzy. He walked east, deeper into the warehouse district, the smell of burnt sugar and stale chemicals replacing the scent of exhaust. He needed a place forgotten by the city, a place with multiple exits and high overhead cover, a logistical needle in the haystack of municipal neglect. He found it 3 blocks later, a derelict freight loading yard adjacent to an old, unused rail line. The buildings here were structurally sound but condemned, their vast, empty interiors perfect for temporary staging. The corrugated metal siding was riddled with rust, and the only signs of life were the persistent, resilient weeds pushing through the cracked asphalt. He slipped through a broken gate, moving with practiced caution. Inside, the noise of the city was muffled, replaced by the hollow echo of his own movement. He secured his pack inside a large, abandoned shipping container, his new temporary operations center. The delay had cost him nearly 2 hours in seeking a secure replacement location. He sat on the cold metal floor of the container, pulling out a small encrypted tablet. He needed to run a diagnostics check on his communication systems and analyze the local surveillance feed for any new abnormalities since his intervention. The irony was heavy, a physical weight in the pit of his stomach. He was hunting a man who trafficked in legal corruption worth millions, yet he had risked the entire operation for the sake of a few dollars and the safety of one child. He started the deep system scrub, reviewing the municipal traffic camera feeds from the zone he had just left. Nothing immediate, no cruisers flashing lights. The city had not yet registered the disturbance. Good. But the moment lingered, sharp and uncompromising. The justification of violence. Frank Castle understood violence intimately. He knew its language, its efficiency, its cost. Most of the world feared it, preferring the safe, sterile language of law and bureaucracy, even when the law was bent and the bureaucracy was corrupt. Alistair Pierce represented the ultimate hypocrisy, the clean hands that engineered the dirtiest outcomes, hiding behind the impenetrable shield of the legal code. When the system becomes the greatest criminal, conventional morality is obsolete, he whispered to the stale air of the container. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, the small messy conflicts that erupted daily in the city's shadows, and the vast Cold War against the infrastructure that created those shadows. To save the system, he had to destroy the mechanism that allowed men like Pierce to operate with impunity. He began the slow, meticulous review of Pierce's daily routine, focusing on the 2 days remaining before the planned extraction. Pierce, according to the files Castle had illegally acquired, was a creature of comfort and meticulous habit. He adhered strictly to his schedule: morning run along the river, 7 a.m., breakfast at the same high-end cafe, 8:15 a.m., arrival at the Dalton and Price Tower, 9:30 a.m. sharp. Tuesday night, the night of the planned extraction, was his charity gala obligation, the perfect, self-serving distraction. Castle focused on the run. Pierce, in his arrogance, often used the same 3-mile stretch of river path, rarely varying his timing. It was the only window where Pierce was physically separated from the layers of protection afforded by his office or his fortified residence. If I can't wait until Tuesday, I might take the risk earlier. The complication wasn't an immediate threat, but a shift in psychological tolerance. The memory of the boy's face, his sheer helplessness, had eroded the final layer of Castle's patience. Waiting 2 days suddenly felt like an unacceptable delay, an extended sentence for the city's weak. He brought up the schematics of the riverside path. It was highly trafficked by other joggers and cyclists, making a discreet, silent capture difficult. The path was also monitored by high-definition cameras maintained by the Parks Department, designed to curb public indecency, but perfectly capable of logging Castle's presence. He spent the next 3 hours mapping every camera, every blind spot, every sewer access point along the path. He analyzed the security patrols, mostly rented security from a third-tier firm, more interested in checking their phones than enforcing the peace. They were predictable, moving in 30-minute cycles. A potential window opened at 7:45 a.m., just as Pierce finished the midpoint of his run. At this point, the path curved sharply around a decaying municipal pier, creating a 90-second visual void from the nearest cameras. The proximity to the water provided an additional, albeit dangerous, extraction route. Castle dismissed the idea. It was too risky. The goal was information, not a splashy confrontation. Any early move could alert Pierce's defense team, compromising the entire data injection and exposure plan. He needed the full chaos of the Tuesday night gala to ensure the maximum distraction and the seamless deployment of the data packet onto the firm's central server. Patience was still the paramount weapon. He forced his mind back to the logistics of waiting. He pulled out the schematics for Pierce's residence, a lavish brownstone on a street known for its excessive quiet and lack of casual traffic. The house was a fortress, but a digital one. The windows were reinforced, the doors secured by multiple deadbolts, but the true vulnerability lay in the networked security system. Pierce used a proprietary, high-end smart home system that controlled everything from lighting to climate to exterior access. Castle had already acquired the necessary encryption keys, but inserting the malware required physical proximity to the house's exterior relay node. He studied the photos taken from weeks of surveillance. The relay node was tucked behind a rosebush, shielded from casual sight, near the main garage door. An arrogance on Pierce's part, believing no one would ever penetrate his digital defenses. Castle visualized the approach again. Tonight, he needed to make the initial insertion, not the full deployment, but the establishing of a silent secondary network connection into the smart home system, a digital tripwire. He needed the cover of darkness and, ideally, more rain to minimize ambient noise and discourage foot traffic. He checked the forecast on the secure channel. Rain starting at midnight, heavy through the early morning hours. Perfect. He looked at the 2 pieces of equipment he would carry tonight, a miniaturized fiber optic tap, designed to look like a simple piece of electrical junk, and a customized low-power directional transmitter. He was going to turn Pierce's overly complex home security into a controlled environment, ensuring that when he arrived on Tuesday, the system would welcome him, not challenge him. The planning was the grind, the necessary evil between moments of decisive action. Every line of code he reviewed, every street corner he logged, was a slow chipping away at the foundation of the corruption. He ran a final check on his weapon cache, which remained sealed. He was moving tonight as a ghost, an electrician, a glitch in the city's power grid. Violence was a last resort, reserved only for moments like the one in the alley, the immediate necessary defense of the truly innocent. He stretched, the stiffness from the long hours in the tunnel still lingering in his muscles. The cold silence of the container was a perfect echo chamber for his resolve. He was no longer Frank Castle, the grieving husband, or the compromised soldier. He was the force that stepped out of the shadows when the cries of the helpless reached their apex. The system had dragged the boy into the alley. He had cried out, and the consequence had arrived. That small act cemented the necessity of the larger war. If the powerful could not be counted on to protect the weak, then the responsibility fell to those willing to break the rules to enforce true justice. Midnight was 5 hours away, 5 hours to rest, to visualize, to purify the approach. The Vigilante campaign was moving forward, measured, brutal, and entirely necessary. He secured the tablet and settled against the cold metal wall, allowing himself only a brief, shallow rest, his senses remaining hyper-aware of the forgotten, broken world outside his hidden container. The dark city was waiting, and the Punisher was ready to deliver the next lesson in consequence. The cold steel of the cargo container was a barrier, shutting out the decay of the port district, while simultaneously amplifying the sound of his own breathing, a slow, measured intake, the rhythm of a man waiting for war. Frank Castle leaned against the wall, the tactical tablet resting on his thigh, the blue glow cutting a sharp line across the shadowed interior. 5 hours until the city would truly surrender to the rain, 5 hours until the small window opened for the initial data insertion. Waiting was the toughest fight. It demanded stillness in a mind conditioned for explosive movement. He closed his eyes, not seeking sleep, but reviewing the mental tapes. The Pierce operation was a long-game strategy, dismantling corruption from the top down, a necessary excavation of the city's poisoned roots. But the immediate visceral memory that kept cycling through his thoughts was the brief, brutal skirmish in the alley, the incident that always reinforced the urgency of his mission. The system was a sprawling, suffocating network, but its failure was most apparent in the sudden, sharp cruelty of street-level crimes. He saw the alley again, a narrow throat of concrete choked with refuse and the acrid smell of old beer and fear. It was just after 10 p.m. He was making a low-pass observation of a peripheral asset linked to Pierce's financial movements, blending into the anonymity of the forgotten neighborhoods. That was when the sound cut through the ambient drone of traffic, not shouting, but a tight, desperate plea, a sound that carried the raw, unpolished edge of absolute terror. They had dragged the boy, no more than 16, thin and sharp-boned, behind a skip overflowing with busted crates. 3 of them, 2 thick, bored-looking men in cheap tracksuits, and 1 jittery wreck of a dealer wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low. They weren't mugging him. They were enjoying the process of intimidation, a casual flexing of power over someone who had none. "You owe, kid," the largest one, a man whose neck spilled over his collar, had grunted, his voice a gravel road. "You think running makes the numbers smaller?" The boy tried to pull away, slipping on the slick, grease-stained pavement. "I told you, please, I don't have it. My mom doesn't pay the rent on borrowed time," the dealer hissed, stepping in close and delivering a quick, open-handed slap that snapped the boy's head back against the brick. That single sound, flat and sickeningly conclusive, was the trigger. The sound of casual malice applied to the defenseless. Castle moved out of the deeper shadows of the abandoned warehouse entrance. He didn't announce himself. There was no theatrical flourish, no warning shot. The time for warnings had passed when they laid hands on the kid. He moved low, a dark silhouette against the meager sodium glow filtering into the alley's mouth. His chosen weapon for that night was a heavy sap, a leather-wrapped tool of controlled impact, designed for maximum disruption without the mess or irreversible damage of a blade or bullet. He needed them stopped, not executed. That was a distinction he maintained carefully in the field. Lethal force was reserved for those who posed a lethal, ongoing threat to the greater good. These were merely disposable thugs, symptoms of the larger rot. The first blow was clinical. The largest thug was focused entirely on the boy. Castle stepped into the blind spot, brought the sap down in a controlled arc onto the point behind the ear, the mastoid process. The man dropped instantly, silently, his knees hitting the pavement with a soft thud, a sack of meat collapsing. The dealer wheeled around, mouth opening in shock, a rusty utility knife already flipping into his hand. He never finished the motion. Castle used the recoil from the first strike to launch a short, sharp kick just above the knee of the dealer, targeting the common perineal nerve. Agony short-circuited the man's central nervous system. He screamed, a high, unnatural sound, and tumbled backward, clutching his leg, the knife skittering away uselessly. The third thug, perhaps marginally smarter, finally registered the threat. He fumbled for something in his jacket, but Castle was already bridging the distance. Instead of striking, he used his shoulder, driving hard into the thug's solar plexus, knocking the wind out of him, folding him like old laundry over the edge of the skip. The man retched, unable to breathe, his focus entirely on the desperate struggle for air. It took less than 9 seconds. 9 seconds from the boy's last cry to the absolute silence of 3 incapacitated men. Castle stood over them, his heavy jacket concealing his form entirely. He didn't look at the men struggling for consciousness or breath. He looked only at the boy. The teenager was pressed against the wall, eyes wide and tracking, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He wasn't crying now. He was frozen, trapped between the terror of the attack and the sheer impossibility of his rescue. Castle's voice, when he finally spoke, was low, raspy, and stripped entirely of warmth. It was the sound of cold concrete. "Get out of here. Now." The boy didn't hesitate. He scrambled past the fallen men, darting into the main street without looking back, running until his silhouette dissolved into the city's indifferent chaos. He hadn't seen the skull insignia, only a terrifying, efficient shadow, and that was how it needed to remain. Castle lingered for only 30 seconds, ensuring the 3 men were truly disabled, conscious enough to feel the pain, but too compromised to pursue the boy or call for immediate backup. He checked the dealer's dropped knife and kicked it into a storm drain. He then disappeared back into the mouth of the abandoned warehouse entrance, letting the city resume its broken rhythm. The incident was a necessary footnote, a small, visceral act of correction in a world demanding correction on a monumental scale. Now, hours later in the container, the memory wasn't a distraction, but data. Data that needed processing. The efficiency of the intervention had prevented a crime, but it had also created 3 potential loose ends. He pulled the tablet back onto his lap, dismissing the schematics of Pierce's brownstone for a moment. He needed to audit the consequences of the alley fight. These thugs were low-grade, yes, but they were almost certainly linked to a mid-tier network that police rarely penetrated. If they were found by the police, their description of the ghost could be dismissed as adrenaline-fueled fantasy. If they were found by their own people, that was the problem. Their boss would want to know who was operating on his turf, using a level of precision that smelled like trouble. Frank accessed a burner network dedicated to scanning low-frequency criminal chatter and cross-referencing EMS and non-critical police reports from the immediate district. He spent the next hour threading the digital needle, sorting through the city's underbelly static. The 3 men were identified quickly. Ramon Monk Ortiz, the big one, Curtis Spider Jennings, the jittery dealer, and Dwayne Hicks, the wheezing one. All minor players, known for debt collection and petty larceny, operating under a man named Silas Thorne. Silas Thorne. The name was a familiar flicker on the edges of the broader map of organized corruption he was building against Pierce. Pierce, the corporate lawyer, the financial architect of disaster, specialized in laundering massive amounts of dirty money through shell companies and complex real estate deals. Men like Thorne provided the necessary muscle for things too crude for a silk suit to handle: evictions, harassment of whistleblowers, and aggressive debt collection. The connection was likely indirect, but the potential for contamination was real. A digital leak about a ghost vigilante operating with military-grade precision in Thorne's territory, shortly before Castle was set to compromise Pierce's security system, was an unnecessary variable. It was the kind of noise that could prompt Pierce to tighten his physical security, just enough to render the initial digital tap useless. Castle needed to neutralize the noise without creating an explosion. He needed to hit Silas Thorne's operation in a way that would make him focus inward, on internal chaos rather than outward, looking for the phantom who put his men in the hospital. He shifted his focus entirely to the secondary target, Silas Thorne's digital footprint. It was crude but present. Thorne ran his small empire using encrypted communication channels purchased on the dark web, relying on a series of nested VPNs and burner phones. He was trying to operate like a professional while retaining the sloppy habits of a street thug. This was Castle's playground. The digital world was cold, logical, and exploitable, much like the human fear response. He found the hub quickly, a cheap rented server farm in Eastern Europe used by Thorne's network to coordinate drops and discuss payment routes. Castle began to write the necessary code, shifting from tactical planner to digital surgeon. He wasn't planning a debilitating virus or anything that would alert federal authorities. He was writing a bespoke piece of digital poison, a slow-acting, pervasive malware designed specifically to introduce maximum internal mistrust and financial paranoia into Thorne's system. The payload was designed to target two key areas: communication integrity and financial ledger accuracy. First, the communication module. The malware would subtly, randomly, and non-conclusively alter timestamp metadata on Thorne's messages and slightly corrupt the playback quality of recorded voice conversations. It wouldn't reveal the content, but it would inject tiny, persistent errors. A contract delivery confirmed for 2 a.m. would suddenly show as 2 p.m. in the receiving log. A verbal agreement would sound faintly distorted, raising doubts about the speaker's identity. The goal was to make Thorne and his lieutenants second-guess every single instruction, eroding the trust essential to their operation. Second, the financial module. This was more complex. The malware would execute microtransactions, tiny, untraceable deposits and withdrawals, less than 5 cents each, spread across dozens of their known offshore accounts, all executed with the correct encryption key. It would never amount to theft, but it would introduce systemic, irreconcilable errors into their ledgers. The books would never balance, the totals would always be slightly off, and the tracking systems would show ghost transactions that suggested an internal skimming operation. Thorne wouldn't blame an external hacker. He would blame his own accountant. He would blame his lieutenants. He would spend the next 2 weeks locked in a paranoid frenzy, trying to find the mole who was siphoning pennies and fouling up the clock. He would be entirely self-consumed, his organizational capabilities reduced to useless, frantic self-preservation. The digital poison was clean, effective, and completely silent. It was a secondary lesson in consequence, delivered not with a sap, but with code. The thugs in the alley had created a ripple. Castle was now ensuring that ripple became a localized vortex, pulling Thorne's world into confusing chaos, thus protecting the integrity of the larger operation against Pierce. He worked meticulously, the light of the tablet illuminating the focused severity of his expression. The structure of the code was elegant, designed to self-destruct after 48 hours, leaving behind only the untraceable digital residue of mutual suspicion. It took him nearly 3 hours to perfect the deployment sequence and confirm the digital tripwires were set. He needed to deploy the code precisely an hour after the forecast rain started. The heavy precipitation would introduce just enough general electronic interference to mask the faint power surge required for the remote upload through a compromised satellite link he maintained. He looked at the digital clock readout. 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until the shift in the weather. The air in the container, previously stagnant, seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum. Outside, he could hear the distinct sound of the first fat drops of rain hitting the corrugated metal roof, isolated, tentative sounds that promised a deluge. The planning was done. The contingency plan for the alley incident was now active. Frank secured the tablet, replacing it with the fiber optic tap and the low-power directional transmitter. His focus snapped back entirely to Pierce and the brownstone. The rain began to fall in earnest, hitting the roof in a sudden, drumming crescendo. It was a cleansing sound, even though it was only washing the city's grime into the already polluted gutters. The water would hide his movements, dampen the sounds of his gear, and clear the few remaining stragglers from the streets. He rose to his feet, the stiff muscles protesting the long wait. He moved toward the container door, his silhouette lengthening in the momentary flash of a distant street lamp reflected on the wet concrete outside. He adjusted the weight of his gear, the familiar heft grounding him. The city waited, wrapped in its blanket of rain and corruption. Pierce was comfortable in his fortress, oblivious to the digital infection waiting to be injected into his walls. Silas Thorne was probably asleep, unaware that a meticulous campaign of digital paranoia had just been launched against him, the cost of his employees' casual cruelty in a dark alley. Frank Castle pulled the container door inward, stepping out into the cold, clean veil of the midnight rain. He was a glitch in the system, a walking consequence, moving through the saturated, silver-lit streets toward the brownstone. The small act in the alley, the defense of the boy, had forced this detour, this necessary complication. But in the long view, the secondary attack on Thorne only further frayed the city's ability to protect the powerful. Every successful night was a lesson in consequence for those who believed they were untouchable. And tonight's lesson was just beginning. He adjusted the hood of his weather-resistant coat, disappearing instantly into the heavy cascade of the midnight storm. The ghost was on the move. The rain was a living thing now, a curtain of noise and cold visibility that washed the neon colors of the city into blurry, indistinct smears. Frank Castle moved with the fluid economy of a deep-sea predator, the heavy drops drumming rhythmically against the waterproof shell of his gear. He kept to the darkest seams of the street grid, the service alleys choked with overflowing dumpsters and the treacherous, uneven pavement beneath fire escapes. The humidity carried the sharp industrial tang of ozone, mixed with the familiar metropolitan stench of hot garbage and stale urine. Every step was calculated, a rejection of the noise he was generating. The water was both his enemy and his ally. It slicked the rooftops and concrete, but it muffled the subtle clicks of his gear and dispersed the telltale heat signature that sophisticated thermal scanners might detect, especially those operated by Pierce's paranoid security detail. He was moving uptown now, transitioning from the derelict commercial district near the docks, where the city's legitimate commerce ended, toward the affluent residential sector where men like Pierce built their fortresses. The sheer contrast in geography was an insult, a visual manifestation of the systemic disease he was fighting. 2 hours ago, he was dealing with the casual cruelty of Thorne's underlings, men who felt entitled to drag a child into the shadows for a cheap, momentary thrill. Now he was approaching the architects, the men who signed the checks that financed that precise strain of institutional malice. The delay, the 3 hours spent meticulously poisoning Thorne's digital infrastructure, sat heavy in his mind. It was a tactical necessity born from a moral obligation. He could have ignored the boy in the alley. He could have maintained his laser focus on Pierce, avoiding the exposure and the time drain. But that path led to a compromise he couldn't afford, accepting the small tyrannies as background noise. No, the small tyrannies were the root system. A thug abusing a child was a consequence of the thug knowing that his boss, Thorne, owned the police, the DA, and the neighborhood. If Castle only hunted the generals and left the lieutenants and soldiers untouched, the machine would simply replace the head and keep running. The lesson had to be total. Every point of corruption, no matter how minor, must introduce consequence. The alley incident wasn't a detour. It was a required systemic sanitation. Thorne's ensuing panic over the phantom transactions would consume his resources, destabilize his local influence, and ensure that when Castle finally finished with Pierce, Thorne would be too weak and distracted to effectively move into the resulting power vacuum. He cut across a loading dock, dropping silently over a chain-link fence that was supposed to protect a construction site. The city was quiet beneath the storm, the rain drowning out the distant sirens and the low thrum of the 24-hour infrastructure. Up ahead, he could see the fainter, cleaner lights of Pierce's territory, tree-lined streets, brownstones with impeccable facades, and the subtle glint of reinforced glass. As he reached the perimeter of the protected zone, he stopped beneath the awning of an abandoned storefront. He pulled a specialized optical device from a secure pouch, a small, highly sensitive monocular that filtered out the atmospheric distortion caused by the heavy rain. He scanned the street leading toward the brownstone. Pierce wasn't just wealthy, he was paranoid, and rightly so. The first defense wasn't men or cameras, it was silence. The street felt wrong, too empty. Even on a midnight storm, the flow of traffic and the occasional late-night pedestrian offered visual white noise. Here there was only the persistent drumming of the water. Then he saw it, not near the house itself, but 3 blocks away, cleverly disguised as a telecom maintenance van parked near a major junction box. The vehicle was subtly elevated, suggesting reinforced tires, and the faint rhythmic glow emanating from its heavily tinted windows betrayed the presence of sophisticated electronics. It wasn't fixing phone lines. It was a mobile surveillance and counter-intrusion platform. The equipment was too high-grade for Thorne, and too professional for the average organized crime outfit. It suggested Pierce was either under deep investigation by an external federal agency, unlikely given Pierce's political insulation, or more probable, Pierce was anticipating an attack from a highly specialized, non-conventional force, maybe a rival syndicate, maybe someone who knew how to bypass standard security measures, or maybe, Castle thought grimly, Pierce knew just enough about the city's ghosts to be genuinely afraid. A direct approach was suicide. The moment he entered that block, he'd be painting a target on his back for the rooftop snipers, or the quick reaction force stationed inside the brownstone. He needed to bypass the surveillance net entirely. He scanned the schematics he'd memorized, the historical municipal plans of the area. Below this section of the city ran a maze of 1930s-era utility tunnels, originally designed to carry steam heat and communications lines, but now largely abandoned, used only for emergency access and as conduits for the primary wastewater overflow. They were poorly mapped, structurally unsound in places and completely unmonitored. The entry point was 70 yards away, beneath a neglected manhole cover in the middle of a 4-lane boulevard. He waited for a break in the infrequent traffic, the few cabs and delivery trucks still brave enough to navigate the flash flooding. He crossed the street low and fast, the rain hammering his hood, covering the sound of his boots. He reached the manhole, a heavy, rusting cast-iron disc slick with rainwater and the grime kicked up by passing tires. He pulled a specialized carbon fiber lever from his pack and inserted the hook beneath the lip of the cover. With a practiced grunt, he leveraged the heavy plate upward just enough to slide a rubber wedge beneath it, ensuring the metallic scrape was minimized against the constant background roar of the storm. He slid the cover entirely to the side, revealing the black, yawning moor below. A wave of humid, fetid air immediately rose up to greet him, a thick miasma of ozone, decaying organic matter, and industrial runoff. It was the city's breath, rank and stagnant. He secured the cover so it could be easily replaced from below, then clipped a small high-intensity UV lamp to his chest rig, casting a narrow beam of sterile blue light downward. The light revealed slick, crumbling brick walls, rusted iron rungs leading into the abyss, and a shallow pool of murky, fast-moving water at the bottom, already several inches deep due to the storm runoff. He slipped one leg over the edge, testing the grip of the metal rungs. They were cold and brittle. He descended slowly, carefully, his hands wrapped in thin, reinforced gloves. The descent took perhaps 20 seconds, but the transition in atmosphere was immediate and profound. Above, there was the wind and the driving rain. Below, the air was still, heavy, and the noise was replaced by a deep, hollow echo, the sound of rushing water amplified by the concrete chamber. He landed in the cold runoff with a soft slosh, the water instantly soaking the lower section of his tactical boots. He looked back up. The hole above was a small circle of grey-blue light, rapidly diminishing as the heavy manhole cover slid back into place, sealing the opening. He was swallowed by the dark. The tunnel was narrow, built for functionality, not ease of movement. The UV light sliced through the darkness, revealing the glossy, black sheen of moisture coating every surface. Along the sides ran thick, armored electrical conduits and large, sweating steam pipes, the city's arteries. The air was breathable, but the smell was aggressive, a combination of old mold, mineral deposits, and the unmistakable metallic tang of static electricity. He started moving inward, following the gradual downward slope of the tunnel floor, heading toward the central nexus beneath Pierce's territory. His pace was reduced significantly. This was not a sprint. It was an exercise in pure patience and meticulous spatial awareness. Every step had to avoid the loose bricks, the broken glass, and the unexpected drops in the floor. A sprain here, a misplaced step, and the mission would stall, rendering the digital attack on Thorn useless. He moved for perhaps 10 minutes, the only sounds his own measured breathing, the low scrape of his gear and the steady, resonant echo of the runoff channeling through the main pipe further below. He reached a large subterranean junction, a cathedral of concrete and steel where the utility tunnels converged, before splitting toward the various brownstones above. It was slightly wider here, offering a temporary reprieve from the claustrophobia of the feeder tunnels. He stopped, his senses stretched thin. The stillness was unnerving. He lowered the beam of the UV light, letting it sweep across the junction floor. That's when he saw the anomaly. Lying in a small, relatively dry recess next to a massive, rusted ventilation shaft was a discarded piece of equipment. It was small, no larger than a cigarette pack, encased in reinforced black polymer. Castle immediately recognized the make and model, a specialized single-use satellite uplink modem designed for short-burst, high-volume data transmission with heavy-duty internal encryption. It was the kind of hardware designed for military black operations or deeply secure corporate espionage, not something you found discarded in a city sewer. He approached cautiously, scanning the walls for tripwires or sensor flares. Nothing. He picked it up, weighing the cold plastic in his hand. It wasn't broken. It had been intentionally destroyed. The modem's central processor housing had been crushed, deliberately ruining the internal memory, likely with a small, specialized tool. They wanted the data gone, but they didn't want to carry the evidence out. But the modem wasn't the crucial piece. Attached to its side, held by a piece of industrial-strength transparent tape, was a small, folded piece of thermal receipt paper. It had been protected from the moisture, a tiny detail suggesting the person who discarded it was either sloppy or in a massive rush. Castle unfolded the paper, holding it carefully under the UV light. The print was faint, standard dot matrix, but the UV light made the chemical residue glow slightly, rendering the text legible. It wasn't a schedule or a ledger, it was a cryptic packing list. 6 units, 0300 HRS, coal transport. 6 units. 6 of what? Drugs? Cash? Weapons? The phrasing, coal transport, suggested high value and high security, something requiring specific handling. More importantly, 0300 HRS. He checked the time readout on his wrist-mounted tactical display, 12:58 a.m. The rain had started an hour and a half ago. Thorne's digital poison was set to deploy in 2 minutes, and Pierce was scheduled to move 6 high-value assets just over 2 hours from now. This wasn't just a meeting or a safe house. Pierce was preparing a sudden, immediate operation or evacuation. The pressure that Castle intended to apply was already hitting unintended targets, or perhaps Pierce was running scared from an entirely different threat that Castle hadn't accounted for. If Pierce moved those 6 units, whatever they were, the window of opportunity to strike at the center of the organization would vanish. The entire structure of the operation relied on Pierce being entrenched and complacent. The consequence of the detour to deal with Thorne, the necessary time spent meticulously crafting digital chaos, was now clear. It had cost him the element of surprise regarding Pierce's immediate movements. He was 2 hours behind the curve. He crushed the note and the destroyed modem in his gloved hand, tossing them into the main sewage flow, where they would be rapidly swept away and destroyed by the rushing, corrosive water. The mission had just fundamentally changed. It was no longer about a controlled strike and measured extraction. It was about interception, acceleration, and maximized consequence before the target slipped away into the night. He pulled a small compressed oxygen respirator over his nose and mouth, filtering the increasingly foul air. He needed speed, and the sewer tunnels, while slow, were the only clean path to Pierce's basement access points. He began moving again, faster now, the need for stealth competing violently with the ticking clock. The rhythm of the water changed around him, the echoes of his movement becoming sharper, more urgent. He was no longer just an avenging force moving in the shadows. He was a ghost in a foot race against time and a phantom shipment. He rounded a corner, navigating the tight confines of the tunnel where the ceiling dropped to chest height. The air here was hotter, closer to the active steam pipes. He could feel the proximity of the structures above, the foundations of the brownstones he sought to penetrate. 300 HRS. He calculated the remaining distance, factoring in the need to breach the basement wall and navigate the internal security grid. He had approximately 90 minutes to transition from the rank darkness of the utility tunnels into the sterile, protected halls of Pierce's operation. The digital deployment against Thorne was likely happening right now, the first invisible ripples of financial chaos spreading through the crime boss's private servers, a silent, confusing scream. That was the long game, but the short game was right above him, waiting for the clock to hit 3. Castle tightened his grip on the combat knife strapped to his thigh. The time for elegant coding and careful planning was over. It was time for consequence, delivered face to face in the suffocating darkness beneath the city's silver shroud of rain. He pressed forward, disappearing into the subterranean shadows, a human counterweight moving against the slow, predictable corruption of the world above. The subterranean rush of water tapered off, replaced by the grating sound of metal against stone. Frank Castle located the rusted clean-out hatch, sealed decades ago by layers of municipal paint and civic neglect. The air here was thin, heavy with the metallic tang of ozone and the deep, persistent smell of hot refuse. He leveraged a compact hydraulic spreader against the hinge plate. the silent force of the tool overcoming the stubborn resistance of rust and age. A faint, almost sickly yellow light bled into the dark tunnel as the hatch groaned upward, creating a tight, awkward egress point into the world above. He paused, the top half of his head clear of the tunnel, the rain immediately hitting the hood of his tactical shell. It was a cold, insistent drizzle now, heavy enough to slick the alley's broken asphalt, but not enough to wash away the accumulated grime. This was not the main street. This was the narrow, pinched space between two 5-story brownstones, a greasy canyon of shadows and forgotten things. Dumpsters leaked industrial fluids onto the pavement, reflecting the distant, broken orange glow of a street lamp that had long given up the fight for clarity. He was focused, tracking the rhythmic tick of the internal clock and the estimated distance to Pierce's basement wall. 90 minutes max, until 03 were HRS. Every second spent breathing the toxic air was a second lost. Then he heard it. Not the clatter of a bottle or the distant siren. It was human. A tight, choked whimper, immediately followed by a rough, guttural command. "Get the hell up, now!" The sound came from deeper within the alley, where the light dissolved completely. It was the sound of imbalance, of predatory leverage being applied to vulnerability. For a fraction of a heartbeat, Castle debated. The mission, the 6 units, the entire infrastructure of Pierce's operation, that was the priority. Letting Pierce escape meant more of this poison in the city. But the whimper repeated, sharper this time, cutting through the ambient noise of the rain and the city's electric hum. "Someone help me." The voice was young, unformed, terrified. The calculation dissolved. Strategy became irrelevant. He was a force operating against decay, and decay was manifesting 30 feet away right now. Frank Castle was a systemic killer, but he was also a filter. He could not step over the immediate, desperate need. He flowed out of the maintenance hatch, the motion smooth and silent despite the weight of his gear, pulling the hatch shut behind him with practiced ease. The concrete tasted sour and metallic under the heavy rubber soles of his boots. He moved along the wall, hugging the brickwork, letting the shadow of the brownstones swallow him whole. 2 figures were silhouetted against a weak spill of light emanating from a cracked window high above. They were street-level noise, low-rent predators. They had a small figure pinned against a grease-stained loading dock. "We just want the package, kid. It ain't worth the teeth, understand?" one hissed. The small figure, a boy barely old enough to shave, struggled weakly, his backpack clattering against the metal dock. "I don't know what you're talking about. Leave me alone." The second man delivered a short, painful strike to the boy's solar plexus. The air rushed out in a gasp, replacing the cry for help with a ragged, watery wheeze. Castle's focus narrowed. The world reduced to the immediate geometry of the conflict. 2 threats, 1 target, 0 time for negotiation. He didn't announce his presence. The men were too engaged in their petty cruelty to notice the disturbance in the shadows behind them. Castle slipped his combat knife from its sheath. It was a tool, designed for silent incision, but tonight it was only a threat of force, a shadow extension of his will. The first man, tall, greasy hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, was focused entirely on the boy. Castle closed the distance, his approach cushioned by the damp asphalt. He brought the reinforced knuckle of his glove down sharply against the base of the man's skull. It was a targeted, non-lethal impact, designed to instantly extinguish consciousness. The man pitched forward, a sudden heavy weight that slumped silently to the wet concrete, his body already neutralized before the sound of the impact could register. The second man reacted slower, confused by the sudden, inexplicable gravity that claimed his partner. He turned, his eyes wide, a cheap switchblade half deployed in his hand, catching the fragmented light. He saw the shape first, vast, dark, and utterly devoid of mercy. He saw the skull insignia, a faded white against the black ceramic plate of the chest armor, a flash of judgment emerging from the depth of the alley. The man raised the switchblade in a desperate, meaningless gesture. Castle didn't even slow his momentum. He stepped inside the knife's arc, delivering a short, brutal chop to the man's wrist, numbing the nerves and causing the blade to clatter harmlessly onto the wet ground. The man instinctively grabbed for his wrist, screaming a silent curse. Frank followed the motion, driving his knee into the man's diaphragm, the impact heavy and concise. The man folded over himself, trying desperately to recapture the air that had been violently evicted from his lungs. Castle caught the staggering weight and guided the man to the ground next to his unconscious partner, ensuring the fall was controlled, efficient, and quiet. The entire confrontation lasted less than 6 seconds. Silence returned, heavier now, punctuated only by the persistent drum of the rain. The boy, frozen against the loading dock, stared wide-eyed at the dark figure standing over the two downed men. He was shaking, not from cold, but from the sudden jarring switch from terror to terrifying safety. Castle knelt beside the boy, his voice a low, gravelly current, muffled by the oxygen filter and the sheer weight of his presence. "Who are you? What did they want?" The boy struggled to regulate his breathing, pointing a trembling finger at the first unconscious man. They grabbed me outside the restaurant. I was making a drop. They said I saw something earlier. A truck." Castle's senses tightened. A truck. Cold transport. What kind of truck? Not a big one. White van, but fancy. Looked like a meat locker or something. Parked near the old loading bay on Thorn Street. I saw two guys moving boxes, big metallic boxes, with specific handles. They were wearing badges I didn't recognize. Not Union, not City, Thorn Street. That was blocks out of the way, but it correlated with the general quadrant of Pierce's operation. More importantly, it established a pre-staging location before the final transport. If the 6 units were being loaded at 03 Ojo HRS from the brownstone, they had to be staged nearby first. "What time did you see this?" Castle pressed, urgency overriding caution. "Maybe an hour ago, just before the rain got heavy. They saw me watching the reflection in the diner window. That's why they came after me now. They thought I was following them." The boy had provided a critical piece of reconnaissance, a low-level accidental witness who had stumbled upon the movement of the assets. Pierce was moving the cargo before 03 Diodra HRS into the brownstone, intending to move it out at 03 Diodra HRS. The timing was tighter than Castle had thought. He stood, his shadow looming over the terrified boy. "Go, get somewhere safe. Tell no one you saw anything here." The boy didn't need a second instruction. He scrambled past the fallen bodies, disappearing into the slick dark of the main street entrance to the alley. Castle turned his attention back to the men. He used a zip tie from his tactical belt to secure their wrists tightly, efficiently checking their pockets for anything that wasn't lint or loose cash. On the second man, he found something of interest, a cheap laminated ID card, the kind used for temporary access to restricted industrial zones. The photo was blurry, but the name, simply J. Friel, was clear. The address listed was a warehouse district near the docks, an area usually reserved for legitimate shipping, miles from here. More telling than the ID was a small folded map tucked into the sleeve. It was a crude, handwritten diagram on the back of a delivery slip, outlining a specific route between the Brownstone district and the old Thorn Street loading bay the boy mentioned. Marked clearly in thick red pen was a specific storm drain cover adjacent to the loading bay, identical in design to the one Castle had just emerged from. They were using the utility tunnels for the initial movement. Not the final transport, but the staging. They were utilizing the city's underbelly to quietly ferry the assets from the warehouse staging area into the final point of evacuation at the brownstone basement. This changed everything. He hadn't just intercepted 2 thugs trying to shake down a witness. He had intercepted a piece of Pierce's logistical chain. The cold transport wasn't a single movement at 03 Eziao's HRS. It was a timed sequence of transfers. Castle crushed the makeshift map in his hand, the brittle paper protesting the sudden violence. The detour, the seconds lost, had purchased intelligence far more valuable than the time spent. The brownstone was still the objective, but now he knew the source of the inbound shipment, the storm drain cover on Thorn Street. If he could access the tunnel network there, he might be able to intercept the remaining units, or at least the logistics team mid-transit, where they would be exposed and vulnerable instead of fighting a prepared defensive position in Pierce's basement. He checked his tactical display. 1:15 a.m. He had gained knowledge, but lost precious minutes. The window had narrowed further. He was now operating on borrowed time and accelerated risk. He secured the 2 unconscious men to the loading dock support structure with heavy-duty plastic flex cuffs, leaving them in the cold, wet darkness. They were small time, but they had tried to silence a witness to a major transfer. They would not be able to interfere again. Castle moved back toward the drain cover he had used to ascend. He dropped back into the foul air of the tunnel, the heat and smell of the subterranean world immediately enveloping him again. He shifted his trajectory, bypassing the direct route to pierce his brownstone. He needed to pivot and head toward the older, forgotten sections of the utility grid that ran under Thorn Street. The sewers beneath this city were a labyrinth of forgotten industry and municipal failures, a perfect, silent highway for organized crime. His pace quickened further, the internal battle between stealth and speed reaching a fever pitch. He was deep in the pipes now, the walls narrower, the corrosive water higher, lapping at the tops of his boots. He focused on the rhythm of his movement, counting the turns, marking his position relative to the structures above using the low-frequency sonar reader embedded in his gauntlet. The city above was a silver smear of rain and indifference. The people slept, dreaming their safe small dreams, unaware that the real toxic metabolism of the metropolis operated just inches below their feet, moving its illicit cargo in the dark. Castle was the only thing moving against that flow, the only countercurrent strong enough to create resistance. He reflected on the brevity and necessity of the alley encounter. He had saved the boy, fulfilling the core mandate of his war, protecting the innocent from the immediate casual malice of the corrupt. But that protection came at the cost of strategic time. What if those two men had been carrying one of the 6 units? He ran the scenario. If the units were small enough to be manually transported through the tunnels, the threat was even more decentralized, the interception harder. But the boy had described large metallic boxes, high value, perhaps too sensitive for street thugs to handle directly. These men were just low-level cleanup, tasked with erasing witnesses. He followed an old feeder line, crawling on hands and knees through a section that had suffered structural collapse, the stone rough and abrasive even through the heavy fabric of his gear. He emerged into a larger conduit, the ceiling high enough for him to stand upright again. He checked the sonar. Thorn Street was directly above him now, maybe 50 feet down the line. He stopped briefly, pulling the compressed respirator deeper over his mouth. The air here was almost unbearable, stagnant, thick with chlorine, and the exhaust of some illegal venting system nearby. He activated a small thermal imaging optic. Ahead, the tunnel bifurcated. The left path was dark, wet, and cold. The right path glowed faintly with residual heat, and the sonic profile registered the distant, distinct sound of a motorized winch or conveyor belt, the kind of equipment used in industrial loading docks, not sewage tunnels. He opted for the heat. It was riskier. Heat meant activity, but it was where the logistics were happening. He moved into the heated tunnel. The atmosphere became stifling, humid. The walls began to show signs of recent modification. New sealed joints, where the old brick met modern concrete, indicating recent, unauthorized tunneling or patching. They had prepared this route meticulously. The noise grew louder, resolving into the metallic screech of rollers and the muffled sound of low voices echoing strangely in the pipe. Castle slowed his pace, transitioning back into pure stealth mode. He pressed himself against the curving wall, allowing the shadows cast by the intermittent work lights that shouldn't exist down here, to conceal the silhouette of his armor. He rounded a final bend. The tunnel opened into a large circular subterranean cavern, an old pump station long decommissioned, judging by the massive rusting iron gears mounted on the far wall. The chamber was brightly lit by temporary floodlights running off an external generator, creating blinding contrast between the light and the enveloping darkness. And there they were, the cold transport operation in motion. 2 men, dressed in matching, unmarked dark jumpsuits, supervised the movement of 3 large, vacuum-sealed metallic containers. The containers were indeed large, handled by a small rail-mounted dolly system that fed directly into a newly bored, reinforced shaft leading upward, the vertical axis connecting the tunnel system to the brownstone basement. The containers were slick with condensation, suggesting they were being actively refrigerated. They were labeled only with heavy numerical barcodes, 01, 02, and 03, 3 units, already staged, already moving toward the surface. If 01, 02, and 03 were already in motion, that meant the remaining 3 were either still at the Thorn Street staging point or perhaps being loaded onto the tunnel system now. Castle checked the time again. 1:25 a.m. They were a full hour and 35 minutes ahead of the 0300 HRS deadline. Pierce wasn't just preparing to move, he was already executing the plan, pushing the assets out early, likely spooked by the digital chaos Castle had unleashed on Thorn. He couldn't engage here. Not yet. This was an access point, a temporary logistics hub, not the core objective. If he engaged, he would eliminate 2 low-level operatives and 3 units, but the remaining 3 and Pierce himself would vanish into the city's defensive network before Castle could even surface. He needed to follow the cargo, let them draw him into the final objective. He watched the 2 men. One barked an order into a handheld radio. The voice was crisp, professional, unlike the guttural sneering of the street thugs. These were dedicated security, perhaps mercenaries. Units 01 through 03 confirmed ingress to the vertical shaft. Start processing 04 now, clock is still running hot. The man looked nervously back down the tunnel Castle had just traversed. He was expecting the next wave of shipment. Castle realized his position was untenable. He was caught between the staging ground and the final destination. He needed to get ahead of the transport, breaching Pierce's brownstone before the 3 inbound units arrived, and definitely before the other 3 were moved. He reversed his path carefully, backing out of the floodlit chamber and into the welcome darkness of the connecting pipe. The strategic objective remained the same, the brownstone basement. But now he knew the time had been accelerated, and the defense would be tighter, more agitated. The consequence of the alley detour was finalized. He had gained critical intel, but had pushed the clock into the red zone. He was no longer trying to intercept a pre-scheduled departure. He was running against an active mid-transfer operation. Frank Castle resumed his pace, ignoring the burn in his muscles and the exhaustion fighting against the adrenaline. He was moving faster than he had all night, a ghost accelerating through the dark veins of the city, driven by the knowledge that Pierce was actively running, and the window of opportunity was shrinking to the width of a razor blade. He had to surface now, find the brownstone and breach the final defenses before Units 01, 02, and 03 reached their safe harbor and before the others were pulled into the network. The mission had become a pure sprint. The man was ahead of the curve, but Castle was still running the shorter distance. He found the vertical access shaft precisely where the schematics indicated, masked beneath a crumbling maintenance hatch marked with faded municipal paint. The lock was a new addition, a magnetic seal humming with proprietary power. Castle fed the bypass key into the terminal. The light flashed red, then solid green, and the deadbolt whispered open, releasing the pressurized air from the deeper network. He climbed the ladder, the steel cold against his gloves, the silence of the vertical ascent a jarring contrast to the mechanical rhythm of the tunnels. He surfaced not into a grand basement, but a utility room tucked behind a series of boiler units. The brownstone cellar was vintage New York, thick, sweating stone walls, the faint smell of oil and forgotten dust. But the center of the room was new. It was cut through by the rising rail system, bathed in harsh blue-white industrial lighting that illuminated an array of communication equipment and surgical stainless steel. It was sterile and terrible. 2 men stood guard near a large reinforced door, the access point to the main house. They were professionals carrying carbines, wearing specialized earpieces. They didn't belong in this city or any city. They belonged in a cage. Castle didn't give them the chance to see him. The first man turned a fraction too slow, as Castle's boot connected with the back of his knee, folding the joint backward with a sickening hydraulic thud. As the man dropped, Castle was already sweeping the muzzle of his suppressed weapon across the room, firing twice. 2 rounds impacted the second guard's upper torso armor plate, driving the air from his lungs in a guttural cough. The kinetic shock slammed him against the furnace, leaving him winded and disabled. Collapsing in a heap of useless high-tech gear, silence returned, absolute and immediate, broken only by the persistent, muffled vibration deep within the stone floor. Castle stepped over the downed guards and approached the communications rig. The screens showed schematics, logistics data, and a heavily encrypted satellite feed. The central screen displayed a countdown. ETA 0003:15. Units 01, 02, and 03 were minutes from arrival. He kicked open the door to the next room. This was the command center. Arthur Pierce sat behind a sprawling antique desk, his hands resting on polished walnut, looking less like a criminal mastermind and more like a CEO waiting for a board meeting. He wore a finely tailored suit, perfectly pressed even at 1:40 a.m. He held a small black phone to his ear. "They're down. I repeat, the 2 tunnel operatives are unresponsive. We have a breach in the basement." Pierce's voice was calm, almost bored, though his eyes, catching the silhouette of Castle in the doorway, suddenly grew wide with crystalline fear. "I need extraction now. Secure the asset manifest. Destroy the logs." The sentence was interrupted by the deafening crack of a single, non-suppressed shot. The bullet struck the expensive monitor bank above Pierce's head, showering the room in sparks and glass, silencing the corporate panic. Pierce flinched, instinctively ducking behind the desk, scrambling for a panic button or a hidden drawer. Castle advanced, moving into the room, his armor soaking up the dim light filtering through the broken monitors. "We don't have time for extraction, Pierce." Castle's voice was low, gravel on steel. "The clock ran out an hour ago." Pierce rose halfway, revealing the glint of a small, decorative pistol. "This is madness. You have no idea what you're interfering with. This is high-level logistics trade. We are providing a service." "You're trading in flesh," Castle corrected, his focus unwavering. "I know exactly what I'm interfering with." The air in the basement suddenly changed. The persistent, heavy rumble intensified. The rail system in the adjoining utility room shuddered, grinding to a halt. Pierce's eyes flickered to the basement window, a sick euphoria replacing the panic. "Too late. The assets are secured. You stop the delivery, but the cargo is already here. You lose." Clunk, clunk, clunk. The rail dolly had delivered its payload. 3 metallic containers, vacuum-sealed and cold, now sat in the light of the utility room. They were numbered 01, 02, and 03. They were not coffin-sized or even trunk-sized. They were small, too small for a full adult. Pierce, confident now in his horrific success, straightened his suit. "You see the efficiency? 3 units delivered precisely on time. The demand for specialized transport is astronomical. We manage the supply chain from the street thugs you clear out, all the way to the end user. We were helping the city, cleaning up the loose ends." Castle looked at the 3 small units, the condensation beading on the cold steel. He thought of the sound in the alley, the distant thin plea swallowed by the city's indifference. He cried out, "Someone help me!" The weight of the operation settled, the dark logic connecting the street dealers, the derelict warehouses, the tunnels, and the sterile, profitable corporate cruelty of the brownstone. The boy, and others like him, were never going to be released. They were inventory. Castle lifted his weapon, not aiming at Pierce's head, but at the immaculate network hub next to the desk, the heart of the operation. He fired 3 times. The proprietary servers exploded in a blinding flash of copper and silicon. "The supply chain is broken," Castle stated. Pierce shrieked, no longer the composed executive, but a terrified animal watching his kingdom burn. He raised the decorative pistol, his hand shaking violently. "You can't stop this. I have contacts. I have money." "You have 5 minutes," Castle interrupted, raising his primary weapon and sighting down the barrel. 5 minutes until the city realizes your generator is dead, your lights are out, and your inventory is exposed. 5 minutes until I make sure this whole operation is wiped clean." Pierce didn't fire. He simply stared, the enormity of the failure, the absolute finality of his judgment, setting in. He saw the cold, righteous fury in the eyes behind the skull plate, a reflection of every desperate choice and every life he had categorized as expendable asset. Castle's silence was the only required sentence. The weapon discharged. The sound was not loud but definitive. Frank Castle turned his back on the wreckage, on the spilled blood that would forever stain the antique rug, and on the 3 cold containers that represented the worst of human failing. He had gained intelligence, eliminated the network, and destroyed the inventory staging point. He had failed to save the victims already processed, but he had ensured that Units 04, 05, and 06 would never make the transit. The trade was dead. He exited the way he came, back down the utility ladder, leaving the dead operation to be found by the dawn light and the police sirens that would inevitably follow. The silence of the tunnels welcomed him, a temporary reprieve from the noise of the surface. In the end, It was not about saving the boy in the alley, or even about delivering justice for the boy. It was about destroying the system that treated the boy as cargo. He returned to the darkness, the vigilante disappearing into the subterranean veins of the city. He carried the weight of the night, the knowledge that the corporate darkness was often colder, sharper, and far more dangerous than the street-level thugs who merely pulled the trigger. The street was the symptom, Pierce was the disease, and the disease was now quarantined. Frank Castle moved on, already calculating the next necessary violence, melting back into the shadows that were his armor, his sanctuary, and his permanent, lonely punishment. The city, oblivious to the horror purged beneath its feet, continued to sleep.